Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. I've got Tim Helm today, Research Director at Prosper Australia, to unravel the mystery of some five-letter acronyms you may have come across: ATCOR and EBCOR. Is it ACTOR and EBCTOR? Look, I don't know what they are, but I've got Tim here to explain what are these ideas. They seem to recur when you look up Georgism and land value taxes. So why don't we get cracking? Tim, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Cam.
Why have I read this name or this word ATCOR? Where does it come from? And is there a big insight there, or is this a bit of a distraction?
Yeah, these two acronyms, ATCOR, ATCOR, and EBCOR,
Yeah.
EBCOR, they are quite common currency within Georgist discussions. So
And
Georgism is the,
what do they
political.
stand for, by the way? Maybe we
Oh,
should tick
sure.
that
Yeah,
off.
yeah. Let's get to that. Yeah. So the ideas are all taxes come out of rent and
So ACTOR, all taxes, or ATC, all taxes come out of rent.
yep.
Is that right?
There's a
Okay.
misnomer, but don't worry about that. And
Okay.
the other one is EBCOR, excess burdens come out of rent. So I'll
Okay.
define it in a moment, or I'll
All
explain in a
right.
moment.
All right.
The first point is they're common currency in Georgist discussions, and this is the philosophy around taxing land in preference to taxing production and income.
Yeah. And so
And
quickly, what's a Georgist discussion? Just for those who are tuning in and don't know.
sure.
I mean, we know it's our.
So, yep. Yep. So the Georgist ethical philosophy is about shifting taxes off productive activity and off, wages and business profits, and shifting them onto land rents. The rent being the return the landowner gets that's unrelated to any effort or cost of production.
Okay.
That's the ethical philosophy, and there's really a branch of economics that you would call Georgist economics that focuses on the causes of land values and the
Uh-huh.
consequences, the distributional consequences of taxing land versus taxing other things.
Great.
So
And
that's
this is
all
based on the
the
work of Henry George, who wrote Progress and Poverty in 1879, right? So there's a bit of a school of economic thought that's come out of his writing.
Yeah, and I'd also note that his economics, as opposed to his ethics, his economics was more or less black and white, classical economics from
Mm.
uh, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill before George.
Oh, okay. So he didn't come up with the at-core, eb-core idea, though, did he? That's
No, I don't think so. In fact, the ideas go a long way back to the physiocrats, who were French economists that preceded Adam Smith, who saw they had a slightly wacky economics that saw land as the fertile properties of agricultural land as the kind of source of all value in the economy, everything else being a transformation. And Adam
Mhm.
Smith thought weird, and he recognized that labor could add value along the way. It wasn't all original powers of the soil. So he called them oddballs in various ways, but he also endorsed their view that all taxes are ultimately paid out of land rents. And this is the actual principle. So it really does come all the way back to Smith. And I think George made a sort of straight up and down representation of Smith, and it was
Mhm.
accepted through Ricardo and Mill, that the same would hold. The idea being that if you tax somebody, that body, let's say a worker or a business owner, that person can afford to pay less for the land that they use for their business, or that
Uh-huh.
they rent for occupancy, and that the land rent, the price they pay for the pure location service, is a reflection of the competition between them and all people in similar situations. And so if you reduce the income, or the purchasing power after tax of
Mm.
business owners and people, they can afford to pay less to occupy land. So ultimately, Smith has some great quotes, which of course I can't remember, but the point being, wherever you lay that tax, the ultimate effect is that it will be reducing the income of the landowner. And
Right.
that Georgism as 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 an economic doctrine says more or less, why don't we just tax that land directly, which is also what Adam Smith concluded, instead of doing it indirectly and causing these distortions along the way by reducing business activity. So that's the
Or
connection between ATCOR and its history of ideas and the Georgist view.
right. So I'm just Googling while you're explaining, and it looks like it was Mason Gaffney who came up with this acronym. And perhaps we can just really give people a simple, memorable idea. You were sort of saying, well, if everyone's incomes are lower because they're taxed, well, they'll pay lower rents for their housing. Lower rents for their housing flows through to lower land values for landlords because the cost of the house is fixed. So you lower the rent, that pushes down the residual, the last thing in that stack of payments that happen in the economy. Is that another way of explaining it?
Yep, that's a perfect way. And
Okay.
we can even do it more directly with other taxes, like development charges, for example, are a tax that's not on land income per se, but it's on particular uses of that land, like developing it into new dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
And the way a developer considering acquiring land for development does their development feasibility calculation is they simply net that off the price they think it's worth paying for the land. So you can see the ATCOR principle operationalized in actual business practices in ways that everybody knows and understands. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
So,
a
for example,
helpful.
let me
Sorry.
just give you a worked example. Let's just say you've got a vacant piece of land and you want to spend $500,000 to build a house that's worth $1 million when it's built. Um, you're saying if I tax that property owner, the house doesn't become worth more than 1 million. The tax actually comes out of their rent. So if I do a $50,000 developer charge, instead of the land being worth 1 million minus the $500,000 development costs and being worth the residual, the leftover, the 500,000, now we add this tax of 50,000. The house is still worth a million. It's not now worth 1,050,000. The dwelling costs 500,000 to develop, plus there's this extra 50,000. So now the land's only worth 450. So that tax came out of the rent. The value of the house didn't come out of the price, the buyer had to pay for the property. So and that's been shown, right? We've got lots of good evidence that developer charges are incident. That's what we call it in economics on land. Right. So that's ATCOR. I think that's pretty clear. What's EBCOR? I mean, do
Yeah,
we need
yeah.
these acronyms? What's EBCOR? It seems like a weirder one.
Yeah, it's the same principle in essence, but the excess burden
Mm.
refers to I'm going to use more jargon here, the economic cost of a tax in terms of reducing valuable economic activity. So it's the value of what doesn't happen due to the tax. So in that
So,
example I said before of a developer charge, that might at the margin reduce the feasibility of some development and cause that development not to happen. Okay, forget general equilibrium effects, etc. Let's suppose across the jurisdiction a bit less development happens due to developer charges, or it's
mhm.
the what is developed is a bit less suitable to buyers' preferences on the demand side. So there's some lost value, some trades that could have happened and some, welfare or surplus or utility that buyers would have got doesn't exist in the economy. And by the same process of competition between buyers feeding back into land prices, the aggregate willingness to pay for land has fallen because there is this reduction in value created in the economy, reduction in income. So an excess burden measures this a destroyed economic activity. It's also called a deadweight loss. And the idea EBCOR, excess burdens come out of rent, is just the point that the economic costs of a distorting tax
Mhm.
find their way into reducing land values, just as the transfer of money from the taxpayer to the tax office finds its way into a reduction in land
Okay.
values.
I see. So let me just try and summarize all that. Um, let's just say, back to our $1 million house, right? Let's just say that house is worth 1 million because everyone has a household income of 150,000 or whatever the number is, right? After tax household income. Let's just put some numbers to it that aren't too far from reality. Now, if we got rid of um, taxes on income, you might have a $200,000 household income. And therefore, if everybody has that, they'll, instead of paying 1 million, they might pay 1.3 million for the house. And because it still costs only 500,000 to build, you've got your land now, instead of being worth 500,000, it's worth 800,000. So that tax on the um, income of the households actually reduced the value of land from 800,000 to 500,000 in that example, because it made households have 150,000 net income instead of 200, meant they could only bid 1 million instead of 1.3 million for the dwelling. And that all went back down the chain to land. What you're saying is EBCOR basically says it doesn't matter if it was a tax that made you poorer, that, you know, your household income went from 200,000 to 150. If it was just pure inefficiencies because of clumsy regulations or opportunities forgone in the economy that made us poorer, right? The efficiency loss, that would still reduce your real income from 200,000 to 150 and still flow back down and make land worth less. Is that,
Yeah,
a simplified example of those two concepts? It doesn't actually matter what makes household incomes lower, efficiency losses or taxes, they both flow through to lower land rents.
yeah, that's right. So in
Okay.
that case, you said the household income fell by 50,000 due to the
Yeah.
tax. You split the difference. Supposing there was $25,000 that they paid to the tax office, and they
Yeah.
also said, screw this, we're not going to work on Fridays anymore.
Uh-huh.
And they reduced their pre-tax income by $25,000 as well. So their net of tax income
Right.
fell by 50. So that's a combination of of a transfer and some destroyed economic activity in the economy. Now,
Yeah.
we
So,
could trim around the edges and say that they value their free Friday, but let's forget about that for now. Uh,
yeah. So
there's
these are,
some income in the economy that would find its way into house prices and then into land. Hey, there's one more point I just want to
yeah.
note for some of your listeners. We've been talking about rents, and also in your numerical examples, you've been talking about land values. There's a direct connection between them. So rent is the word we use for the recurrent payment or income, and value is the asset value. Now, in land, typically we don't directly contract for the recurrent services of land. You don't pay a lease to use a bit of land for a year outside of agricultural
Yeah.
situation. Typically, you buy a chunk of it, and that's the asset value. But the two things are connected by asset pricing, as you've explained really well.
Yeah.
So the two acronyms talk about rent. It's equivalent to say it comes out of value.
Yeah. Because the value of the land is just the representation of all those future flows in one upfront payment rather than annual payments. Yeah. So they're sort of both representing the same flow of value. Yeah. So that's a good point. Now, one of the weird things about this is, doesn't it predict that, well, if our incomes go up, then that all flows through to land rent. So how does anyone get richer if they don't own property rights to land? If everyone's income's rising, the only people who net benefit are property owners. And then that also implies that it doesn't matter if we're more efficient because the cost is only on property owners, right? The real incomes of households are the same. Like, it sort of seems to undermine the logic of growth and rising real wages. Or am I missing some kind of other trade-off that is we've had to oversimplify to make the point? What do you make of that, Tim?
So yeah, many answers. First of all, for context, there's this a book. I've got an old book to sell you. This is the The original tome from Georgism was Progress and Poverty by George, and the paradox in the title is that you can have progress, which is just call it GDP growth,
Hmm.
alongside enduring poverty, like the poorest people aren't getting any richer. And so that was what George observed and essentially founded his doctrine on ending that cycle because he saw all the benefits of growth went to the landowners. But it does sound a bit dismal and unrealistic. So here's how I think
Yeah.
we should interpret these concepts. So we should interpret these as long-run equilibrium tendencies. That in the long run, and that is where competition between all, if you like, mobile factors of production, labor and capital, anything that can move or
Hmm.
reduce in quantity, or go somewhere else. All the differences in returns across places and differences in returns between using that resource and not using that resource, say between labor and leisure, all those little
Hmm.
changes are worked out and we're left in a static situation. That's what we call a long run equilibrium. And in the long run equilibrium, yeah, there's no, in principle, reason to expect non-landowners to get any benefit out of economic growth, or productivity gains or
Uh-huh.
reduction tax on wages. That all accrues to landowners. So of course, like the history of I don't own any land and I live a pretty good life compared to when Henry George was alive. So
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
there's plenty of in the sequence of short runs that we live by, there's clearly plenty of scope to improve people's lives, and there's clearly distributional impacts of different tax and economic policies. If you do reduce income taxes on the poor, that will improve their quality of living in a way that doesn't immediately flow through to 100% through to higher land rents. So we should think about, in my view, the time period over which we're trying to influence economic outcomes, distributional outcomes, that's a short run. It's a sequence of useful short runs. And as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. And in the long
Mm.
run, ATCOR and EBCOR might well apply fully and literally, but in the short run, we have influence over policy. But
Mm.
the long run does tell us where the system works its way towards if left alone. And I suppose another point here is the pace at which you reach that long run depends on some institutional factors, like how sticky we are in remaining in a particular city versus somewhere else. Say there's a highly taxed city, and the taxes are going up. Does that immediately flow through to lower land rents in that city? Well, only to the extent that people leave. So there's cultural factors like the stay-at-home bias and
Right.
slower migration will slow down our evolution to that equilibrium. So
So
policy can be just good.
yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is this is a force or a tendency in the economy, but it's actually mediated quite a lot. So maybe we can come up with some examples of that. So in my mind, there's a couple of examples. Firstly, you might um, the the ownership is not just like there's one person who owns the land and gets everything, and there's one other person. We all sort of own little shares of land-like property rights. I think if I own a pharmacy in Australia, I'm sort of protected. I've got this exclusive property right to be a pharmacist, and I'm protected from new entrants. And so that's kind of like another land-like asset. I might own a brand or some intellectual property, which is also a type of unreplicable property right, like land that will accumulate these net gains, right? So there's actually the distribution of these things, these ownership of land like property seems important to the distributional effect of growth on net incomes of households. Would you agree with that? That it's sort of points to the fact that um, growth has tendencies to accumulate returns on property owners of all sorts of intellectual property, real property, rights to mineral resources, all these type of land-like exclusive rights. But if we distribute those broadly, then the distributional effects of growth are reduced and everyone gets to share in them some more. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I think that's right. And the essence is economic rents arise everywhere. Land rent was the original uh, and most obvious economic rent. And economic rent is any return that exceeds the opportunity cost of creating that income. Any income in excess of the cost incurred uh, by the person who created it. So if say I have some non copyable skill in, for example, being a Georgist economist, and demand for that rises inexplicably, then competition for supplying Georgist economic advice it cannot compete down my income to the point where I'm indifferent between working as a Georgist economist and sitting on my ass. And without that competitive process, the rents persist, and therefore some of this growth in social prosperity and productivity can pass its way through to people who own non-replicable skills and businesses that have some unique advantage
Mm-hmm.
that's not just locational, as well as passing through to land, which is clearly not able to sustain competition in the same way because you can't
Yeah.
move it around. So in short, there are rents all over the economy, including rents particular types of workers hold due to specific skills.
Right.
So
So you're
yeah,
even saying, like, if I become a medical doctor, I invest in those skills. I'm kind of like buying a property right for this exclusive thing of being a certified doctor. And I'm sort of getting a return like a property owner to land from my property right to this hard to replicate uh, training as well. So, actually, broadly speaking, we sort of collapse the problem back to a distributional one, right? Does that make sense? Like, if there's rent sort of rising anywhere, then and the problem of growth and who's left behind is really about distribution. Who gets
you mean
valuable?
rich and poor? Is that what you mean by
Yeah.
distribution?
So I guess
Yeah.
let me try and I'm trying to reconcile 2024 with 1872, right?
Yeah.
Where we kind of had property rights to land, but we didn't really have intellectual property as much. We didn't have um, so many exclusive professions that, the accounting board looks after their accountants and you need a certified accountant for this. And that kind of protects a little property right for those accountants, right? And so
Yeah.
when there's growth, they get a share of growth, just like the landowner, because they've got this little land like property right to being an accountant, which is a sort of protected privilege. So I guess these days we've got lots and lots of those all around the economy, and it's how we create and manage those little protected um, property rights, for taxi licenses, for pharmacies, for registered accountants, for qualified doctors, all these sort of skill based property has a big distributional effect. It's much more muddy today than in George's time. All taxes flow out of land rents, and it's just this small group of landowners. It's all taxes come out of rents, but actually everyone's got a sort of a bit of the rent based on their skills, their education, their ownership of intellectual real property, and everything else. Would that sort of be a
Yeah.
way to show how the principle still applies today? It's just a little bit muddier.
Yeah, I think so. And
Or
I'd just qualify this slightly by saying it's not just these tiny uh, statutory monopolies or certification monopolies, the
Mhm.
pharmacists lacking competition. It's not just that. It's also unique skills, such as the Georgist example I gave for
Mhm.
myself. And one, I would say over time, there's push and pull factors that would tend to um, go both ways in how those rents rise or grow. And I'd say as the economy's become more diversified, there's more
Hmm.
of an opportunity for you to be the only one in your niche,
Mm.
and or more and more niches to really grow. So as we've globalized our trade and communications, you can really find a smaller niche, and if you're the best in that much smaller niche, you can be, I mean, you can be making a lot of money just having say, a
Yeah.
YouTube, say, you can have a podcast. So I don't know if you're
Yeah.
making a lot of money, but you can have one that's about land and housing that
Right.
global stage could earn you a rent, one hopes. But
Yeah.
I'd also say there's a push factor or a pull factor, the opposite, where competition from
Yeah.
elsewhere in the past, maybe you had to go to the only hairdresser in town, but in a large city, as we've aggregated into these huge urban areas, there can be competition between
Mm.
hairdressers. And certainly Georgist economic advice. I bet in George's time, the local Georgist had that one really stitched up. And if there was money doing that, then they got it. But now I can work in Australia and live in New Zealand, for example.
So that's super interesting. What's come to mind is that, in a big diversified economy, the ATCOR principle and the EBCOR, it's more complex, and it's not actually that different from our standard economic way of talking about the incidence of tax based on, the marginal exchange between working in one field or another, or becoming a doctor or an accountant. But there are still examples where I think the traditional old school ATCOR view is pretty solid and clear to see. And I'm thinking here of the Gulf states and their oil, right? If the rights to that oil is like the property right, and they get a big economic rent because the market value is much, much higher than the cost of extraction, that just because the price of oil goes up doesn't mean anyone in that country is going to be better off, right? If those oil rights were, for example, owned by American Oil Company or whatever they used to be owned by, right? It's only because those rents get distributed to the population through the nationalization of those rents and the redistribution that the growth, right, of the global economy, and hence the oil demand, actually benefits the population. Would that be a reasonably clear example, like
Yeah,
of a
that would
modern
be, yeah.
version of a simplified ATCOR principle?
Yes, so I'd say that's a clear example, and in that case, the highest standard of living of the locals is uh, maintained by the fact you can't just go and take up citizenship of this place. So I point to that, border controls, let's say, as one of these institutional factors that lets these rents persist. I think I
Mm-hmm.
just want to put back in one thing we talked about earlier. I don't want to give the impression that in a modern economy, things are fundamentally different to 130 years ago, and that all the rents are just contained in our unique specialized skills and our unique business offerings. Because I think there's still a role to look at land in the sense of titles to geographic space as something really special, because for one, the rent you get from land has this character that it's not a product of past investment, whereas a lot of these things we see in the economy, say the high income you get from being a doctor in a protected profession. It's so not just that the profession is protected, but it's the result of a lot of past investment. So my skill, I'm using inverted commas, as a Georgist advocate is the product of years of reading about this. So that actually has a name too, and that's called a quasi rent, which is a return above my marginal cost of production, if you like, or what I'd be willing to the maximum I'd be willing to sacrifice. Oh, excuse me, the minimum. Uh, Forget that. A quasi rent is partly a
Yep.
return on past investment. That's the point I want to make. And so when you see some rent across the economy today in labour market. That's not necessarily of the same character as land rent. So although some of the returns to progress that have been captured in rents all around the economy are captured by people and business owners as business owners, there's a bit of a different character to the ongoing and growing rents that are captured by land. So there's still a role for looking back at the way classical economists divided up the economy into land, labor, and capital, and recognizing that there's something special about the land rents.
Yeah, and that's the sort of moral case, right, as well. And I think for directly taxing land is that the land, all the locations already existed, right? We just drew lines on a map and gave certain people the ability to capture value for themselves rather than collectively. And I think that that's probably why a lot of economists do agree that we should tax land values, because there's a very hard to ignore like moral case, right? Um, no one produced the land. We just drew up the land register and gave it away and or sold it. I guess there's another argument, like if states sold off property originally, auctioned it off like we did in Queensland in the 1850s, auctioned off land. Is it still a rent if you've sort of paid for it once? Or is it only a rent if you got it for free? Is it just a return on a previous investment that you made to the state? I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm convinced by the moral case, but I can see an argument against it that, well, if we didn't just give land away and draw it up and the state actually sold land, then every sale since then is morally okay and it's a return on investments made. What do you make of that?
This does get tricky because it gets into the realm of what did people expect for the future of that land, and so what do they deserve? So in doing the normative case about policy here, the fact that the full return to land is an economic rent doesn't automatically lead to a moral case for taxing it all, because supposing you just simply bought that land off the government yesterday, then you
Yeah.
bought and paid for an expected amount of services. So I think it's just really important to separate out the scientific aspect, which is can we or where do increases in prosperity end up in distributionally? What
Yeah.
what factor of production receives them? What's the incidence of
Yeah.
growth, and what is the incidence of taxes, and where is the incidence of excess burdens? That's a scientific type question where we're asking and explaining what happens in the economy. And then there's the moral question of what should we do as a society? And in that case, it's not as simple as saying, okay, well, that is an economic rent, so we should just tax it all straight away. Depends, on the
Yeah.
particular case involved. I think it's just really important to separate out when you're trying to do economic science to explain things from the moral case for taxing land over something else is it's always going to be quite contingent on what has happened in the past. Hey, there's one
Yeah.
more point that I
Yeah.
think I'd really like to raise if we have
Yeah.
time.
Let's do
It's
that. Last.
slightly separate from this moral point, but it's about we talked about the history of these concepts of tax incidence, ATCOR and EBCOR, and how they were quite standard in classical economics. And one really interesting thing that explains why they are common currency in Georgist conversations, but really not, they're out of the lines of sight in a lot of mainstream economics, is that in the turn to neoclassical economics, where the return to each factor of production was seen as being equal to its marginal product, that was and the focus of economics turned away from distribution of income to the processes establishing prices in the economy, prices of labor, prices of goods.
Mm-hmm.
In that turn, the way of understanding the return to land as a residual sort of got lost. It was seen that the return to everything was the marginal product of that factor. But understanding what the marginal product of land is, what would a little bit more land earn, is quite a tricky question. And there's even an adding up question of if all the marginal products, add to the
Yeah.
total. So in essence, there's an interesting history here that explains how these well understood and agreed upon concepts of tax incidence and of the returns to economic growth, how those sort of got lost in the turn to explaining all prices in terms of marginal utility or marginal product.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do feel like adding land back into economics is having a bit of a resurgence at the moment. And I don't know if it's just because of the 2000s housing boom and the COVID era boom as well. But perhaps we will see a return. There seems to be a lot of interest globally on taxing property and taxing mineral rents and all sorts of things at the moment. It's almost like we're having this long-term cycle in how we do economic analysis, and hence why I thought I'd get you on and ask what is ATCOR about? Um, because if we're
So
going to
what
have
I'm
that
saying,
conversation, we should do it.
and what you're essentially saying is we're trying to drum up demand for what suppliers of land and economic advice can consider. Drum up
Yeah,
demand for Georgist advice, yeah, because there are rents everywhere.
yeah. Look, I think it's really, yeah, it's interesting. Like we're having all these debates about housing affordability and who gets what. And that's exactly what Henry George argued about, and especially during the booms and the busts, during those periods of rapid change, who gets the gains and who misses out. And I think we're living through another period where everyone's interested to know. So why don't we wrap up there, Tim, for today? And I'm sure we could talk about land rents and Georgism and the history of economics for hours, but we'll have to do it again another time. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Cam. Cheers.
Bye.